And welcome to Cult Movie Cult, where we watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink. And this is the 5th episode in our series X-Rated and Animated, The World of Ralph Bakshi, where we'll be digging into the work of a true and controversial auteur of animated cinema. Today we'll be discussing Bakshi's final feature film to incorporate animation to date, the 4% on Rotten Tomatoes classic 1992's Cool World.
I've got news for you, pal. I am not your ordinary doodle. I've been checking up on what these new dames have got going in the real world, and I want it! Don't you see? They're real. They've got power. When they touch something, they feel it. And when they taste something, they really taste it. And when they do it with a man, oh, they really do it.
What can I say, sweetheart? I can't help you out in that department.
All right, so we are going to discuss Cool World, and this is the last part of our Ralph Bakshi series. But first, we want to just go back a little bit, as we've done before, and talk about a little bit of the in-between and what we haven't really focused on in episodes, but we want to just touch on, because we are trying to look at Bakshi's career as a complete thing. So we want to discuss, at least touch on these other aspects. So after American Pop, which was the last film that we discussed, and that was very, I would say, widely acclaimed film, Jeremy. I mean, it was very well received.
Probably, maybe his best
probably his best
his career, yeah.
Most likely, yeah. So he made that film, and then after that, he made a couple other films that it seemed more in line with things he had already done. So he made Hey Good Lookin', which is another kind of like urban tale animated film, and then there was Fire and Ice, which was him returning to the fantasy elements that we saw in Wizards and Lord of the Rings. So he made those two films. He worked with apparently the Rolling Stones. I guess he did like a video for them.
Apparently it was from what I understand, he did a music video for the Rolling Stones. It was a cover of a song called Harlem Shuffle. Yeah. And apparently it was a very problem-ridden shoot.
Oh, really?
Yeah, apparently the Stones, because half of it was live action and half of it was animated. Mm-hmm. And this was actually after a brief retirement, a brief hiatus in Bakshi's career, and an offer from the Rolling Stones is hard to turn down. But there was some live action stuff that they had to shoot, and they only had one day, and the Stones turned up late. And Bakshi go figure. And apparently, because they turned up late, Bakshi ended up actually putting some of his own money into this music video, which they were also on a very tight deadline because they wanted to get it done in time for, I believe, the Grammys. Mm-hmm. So it was kind of a nightmare shoot, but still, for Bakshi, too good of an opportunity to turn down.
Oh, I'm sure. And he did go on to work with other artists. Apparently, he worked with David Bowie. It was with the film we're going to talk about, Cool World, and that was apparently really well received. Apparently, the music, the soundtrack for Cool World was very well received. A lot of people gave it accolades, but the film itself, different story, which we're about to get into. But so he did that, and he returned, which I found interesting, to Mighty Mouse, The New Adventures. It was a new series. He had worked on the older Mighty Mouse in the 60s, I believe, when he was working with Terry Toons and that part of his career. So he returned there as a supervising director and was overseeing that show. And that only lasted a year, 87 to 88. And then apparently he was in a period of depression around this time. He was not, there was a lot of, there was a lack of support for his personal projects, mm-hmm. i.e., Hey Good Lookin', and the fantasy film Fire and Ice probably wasn't, the blockbuster he was hoping for there. So he had some setbacks, and I guess a little bit of a dry period. Apparently, he read Catcher in the Rye again and connected with Holden Caulfield, who is, of course, the narrator / protagonist of that book, and that is one of those notorious books that Salinger has been very steadfast about not creating a film or anything from his novel. And Bakshi, though he wanted to attempt it, I guess he really felt a connection with it. and he thought he could make it work cinematically, I guess, with animation involved, I'm assuming.
Well, and I think what's interesting, and one thing throughout this episode to think about, is Ralph Bakshi is a guy who really kind of valued, for lack of a better term, artistic purity. You know, he
Yes,
really wanted to do what he
definitely.
wanted to do. He wanted the integrity to be in the work, but he's also someone trying to work in a Hollywood system, which in the 1980s was kind of post Jaws blockbuster era. So a lot of
Yeah.
the movies that were coming out, you know, of course there were some amazing movies that snuck through, but historically the 80s in America weren't considered an amazing time for auteur directors. So
A
this
bit conservative, yeah.
a bit conservative, and this idea that, you know, Bakshi is attracted to a book that's all about someone feeling like everyone around him are phonies. You know, I think is pretty interesting, because it
Yeah.
makes sense that someone who is in this corporate, you know, greed is good America, who's
Yeah.
trying to be an artist, of course is going to be rejected and put down. And I think that as we go into Cool World in just a minute here, that's something to keep in mind. Even though it changed over time, what Cool World actually ended up being from the original vision, it is still something to kind of think about as we move forward.
Yeah, definitely. It reminds me a lot of Terry Gilliam. We were actually just talking about 12 Monkeys before we recorded, but it reminds me of Terry Gilliam, the director, and his relationship with Hollywood studios. He has that love-hate kind of thing where he needs them, but he doesn't want to be a part of their system, and he's had a lot of back and forth, and a lot of things fall through. So it's kind of that, yeah, it's similar to what Bakshi was, how he was in acting, I guess, with his career in Hollywood. And so, yeah, ultimately, of course, this his version of The Catcher in the Rye did not come through to fruition, because J.D. Salinger is a recluse who does not want anything to do
Turned him
with
down.
this. So he turned him down. So he went on to other things. And now I don't know if we have to talk about the rabbit in the room here. I hate to use that lame saying there, but Who Framed Roger Rabbit came out, right? So that was 1988. And I don't know if Bakshi saw this and was like, I want to do that, or, you know, because we talked about, I'll give him more credit than that, because obviously we've talked about a lot of his films during the series, and he has always incorporated live action in his movies. Not to the degree, I would say, that Who Framed Roger Rabbit did it, because that was revolutionary. I mean, that broke the mold when it came to merging animated characters with live action. So I wonder if he saw that, and maybe it wasn't even about the idea. Maybe it was more like, now we have the technology to do this. And I wonder if that really appealed to him.
Well, and I also wonder if maybe it has something to do with the fact that Who Framed Roger Rabbit was such a success. It's also possible, because I know that initially, from in my research into Cool World, Bakshi originally wanted to make Cool World as a horror film.
Yes, which is very
It
interesting.
wasn't
Yeah.
kind of, as we'll get into the story in a minute, but it has some definite parallels to Who Framed Roger Rabbit. But initially, it was supposed to be tonally very different, and
Yeah.
I'm wondering if that maybe had something to do with some studio interference, where Bakshi might have already had this idea for this live action animation combo, and then the success of Who Framed Roger Rabbit allowed him to get the money he needed to make this.
I'm sure that, yeah.
So
that
so it's
sounds
a
right.
combination, yeah. Because Bakshi, I from everything we've learned about him and have seen so far, he seems to be an original who wouldn't just do a project to capitalize on or copy
Yeah.
another project. My personal opinion
I would
is
agree.
this probably came more from the parallels probably came more from the studio people and less from Bakshi himself.
Right. Who Framed Roger Rabbit? That film is basically a noir with, you know, detective story with these animated characters in it. And I think in a certain way he was trying to do the same thing, but with horror. Because his original idea for this film, for Cool World, or I don't know what it was called at the time, but his original idea was very much a horror film, and it was you know, almost like a straight horror film, but except it had that animation element to it. So you can see a lot of parallels there. But we'll go into Cool World now. We'll talk about that, and we'll go into a little bit what the actual story ended up being for it. So right off the bat, I just want to say that this movie is very 90s.
Very 90s, yes.
From the music to the wardrobe to the actors. You get a very young Brad Pitt there, one of his first roles. And he plays a character with a pretty tragic backstory.
Yeah.
one of the
So,
one of the main characters. Yep. But we can go into, yeah. You want to just cover what the basic plot is of this film?
yeah, so Cool World is a 1992 American live-action animated thriller fantasy film, so many genres, directed by Bakshi and starring, as we mentioned, Brad Pitt, Kim Basinger, and Gabriel Byrne. And it tells the story of a cartoonist who finds himself in the animated world he thinks he created and is seduced by one of the characters, a comic strip vamp who wants to be real. And as we mentioned, there's also the Brad Pitt character, who is a 1940s soldier with PTSD from World War II, who gets
Returns from
into
the war. Yeah.
yeah, he returns from the war and gets into a pretty horrific motorcycle accident in which his mother is killed, and somehow in the course of that accident ends up in this cartoon world, which is referred to as Cool World, which kind of runs parallel to the real world. And then almost 50 years later, the cartoonist, played by Gabriel Byrne, finds his way into that world, which he believes he's created, but apparently has already been existing for all these years ahead of time, and he's just channeled it into his work.
So it's a little vague, but apparently, so within the film, Cool World is supposed to be a comic book, I believe.
Yes.
Although at first it almost seems like a cartoon, I guess, because you are watching it play out in animation. Maybe that's why it feels like that. But also the way you see him at the drawing board sketching and stuff like that, it seems like it's going to be a cartoon. But in reality of the film, it's actually this very successful comic book series. But they never really explain like what kind of series it is. There's a lot of vagueness around what Cool World actually is. It's definitely impressive as a world, as an actual location for the film. I think it has all those Bakshi elements in it, the seediness, the underground urban urbanness, I guess you would say. The seedy characters and everything. I think it's very Bakshi, which makes a lot of sense. And you do get like a sense of what the world is, but I feel like they never fully explain. I feel like it's very a little disjointed, and I think that's part of the reason maybe this movie doesn't work completely.
Yeah.
But anyway, so before we go into the film, I just want to talk about like a personal thing with this movie. Not really that personal, but just my reaction.
We're getting deep here, Mark.
Yeah.
Deep with Cool World.
Yeah, no, it's nothing like that. It's just one of those movies. I just want to talk about it because I don't know if you had the same feeling, and maybe not with this movie because you're a little bit younger than me, Jeremy. But Cool World was one of those movies that seemed really like dirty and forbidden to me as a kid. Like I remember trying to sneak downstairs or like sneak peeks at the TV when it was on. Like if my parents had it on and they happened to be showing it on TV or something. Like I had obviously no idea who Ralph Bakshi was at the time. All I know was like that I saw this, what looked like a crazy movie with wall-to-wall animation in it. So it's interesting because it appeals to kids for its animation, but it's very much an adult film. In some ways, almost more than some of his other films. I mean, Wizards comes to mind, but like, as far as being like, that was his family movie. But yeah, this is a very, adult film. It deals with adult things. And this one was actually not written by him as well. The writers of this are Michael Grace and Mark Victor. And I looked them up at the most notable thing that I saw was Poltergeist they had written, which is pretty, well, actually, I guess maybe a little bit similar.
Yeah, actually,
things
you mentioned
coming
it.
out of the TV and stuff, yeah.
Yeah.
So a little bit similar, but yeah, it's they deal with looks like a lot of paranormal and horror type things. So it kind of makes sense, and especially with Bakshi's original idea for this. But so they were the writers, and Bakshi was the director, and he took the reins and had a vision for the film, which of course got screwed up by the studio because that's what happens to him, and to many auteurs, I'm sure. When they get put into that Hollywood studio system, it's hard to fight for what you want. It's hard to, maintain your integrity. And as you said, Jeremy, I mean, when I think of Ralph Bakshi, I think of integrity. I think of an auteur, someone who does things his own way. So I'm sure he clashed even more than we know, even more than we read about. I'm sure there was so many battles behind the scenes of this movie.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, like Terry Gilliam before, like this is a thing that kind of happens over and over again. And interestingly, as I kind of mentioned before, I said we should try to keep the idea of Ralph Bakshi fighting against the studio system, and this idea of people in suits who are making money decisions to influence creativity. And to get into the meat and bones of the story a little bit, kind of the villain in this story is a really classic femme fatale. Played by Kim Basinger. I thought actually pretty well.
Yeah.
I thought she was actually maybe the highlight of this film in
Yeah.
terms of
Yeah.
performance. But her character's name is literally Hollywood, like
Hollywood.
Holly space Wood.
Wood.
I believe
Right.
spelled Holli and then
Yeah.
WOULD.
Well, the tagline for this is Hollywood if she could. Wait, what is it?
Uh,
Hollywood if she could,
yeah, and she
and
will.
she will. Yeah, and
She
she will.
will.
Yeah.
But
So
but
no, she
classic,
was.
yeah.
Yeah, she was pretty good. Classic femme fatale. Although
But
apparently, according to Bakshi, Kim Basinger was partly to blame for what ended up happening with the film. But we'll go into that when we get to
yeah.
the end of this. Yeah.
But what I was getting to though is I think just and this decision might have come from the writers, I'm not sure, but I think just naming the villain of this film Hollywood, you know, I think that Bakshi in going with that decision and running with it kind of isn't. I mean, maybe it's just a play, maybe it's just a cutesy kind of, you know, posh noir thing, but I also think there's a certain, you know, truth to it that clearly the enemy to Ralph Bakshi is Hollywood at this point. It's these people who are
You know, I didn't
pulling
even
apart.
make that. Didn't even make that connection, Jeremy.
Yeah, and you
Seriously,
know,
yeah.
and you think about what she does over the course of the
Wow,
movie, and it's
that's
the
great,
kind of
yeah.
thing where, you know, it's the glamour and
Mhm.
it's the seduction, and she wants to be real and
Mhm.
like it does run these weird kind of parallels with the Hollywood studio system and this fight that Bakshi might be having where he knows he should
Definitely.
resist, but it's just too glitzy and beautiful, but
The
ultimately
temptation is.
ultimately the temptation or whatever
Mhm.
it is kind of ruins a man who's trying to have integrity.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, and
so
yeah, that's really interesting. I honestly didn't even think of that till right now until you said that. That's really cool though. I wonder if that was that play there with
yeah,
behind the scenes. But anyway, so yeah, you mentioned her character Hollywood, and I find her an interesting character. I mean, she's pretty one note, but
Mhm.
I find characters that are so driven by one thing, I find them interesting. So I thought it was pretty interesting. So her main goal is basically to have sex with a human because in this world, so it's pretty much established that humans do exist, and these animated characters or these cartoons or comic book characters, whatever you want to call them, also exist in Cool World. So for her to merge with that world, which she so desperately wants to, the quote unquote real world, she would have to have sex with a human. And she sees her opportunity with the actual creator of the comic, played by Gabriel Byrne, named Jack Deebs. And there is already a human living in Cool World, and that is Brad Pitt's character, Detective Frank Harris. And so he's become. I've actually found his interest, his character the most interesting one because he's already kind of acclimated to this world. Even though he's an outsider, he seems like very comfortable with it.
Yeah.
And I found the conceit of his PTSD, that being part of his character. It's like he's trying to forget his past. He's trying to leave the real world behind, like in a very literal way. And I think that's a really cool conceit. Not to use the word cool so much, but
but that's an interesting point because in the same way that the Hollywood character is trying to run away from her circumstances and she's trying because she sees the grass is greener in the real world.
Yeah.
The Frank character, the detective played by Brad Pitt, he sees the Cool World as a safe space that he can live in, that he can kind of put behind the horrors of the real world. So
like he has his role there. He's a detective there, and he's doing his thing. And there's definitely a parallel between him and Hollywood's aspirations, I would say. Yeah.
Well, and I think the cartoonist character, what's his name? It's totally escaping me.
In the film, it's Jack. Jack,
yeah. The cartoonist character Jack. He one thing that is worth noting, which kind of doesn't really get hit on that much, interestingly, is that he starts the prison in jail on a murder charge.
Yeah,
it kind of gets brushed over, but
did they gloss over that, or did I miss something?
No, they kind of gloss over it a little bit.
Okay,
but I think what's interesting is even he clearly has something that he's kind of running from.
Yeah.
So it is set up really nicely.
Yeah, with those three characters, like they, and that's part of when we talk about this film had a lot of potential. I think there are lots of elements in it that are very interesting. To keep using that word, I'm trying to think of a different word, but it's fascinating in a way. The different aspects of the film, but yeah, I think part of what makes it not work, and I'll go into this a little bit later too. But I think the characters, particularly Jack, the creator of the comic, I mean, he in a sense is supposed to be the central character here. I'm getting the notion when I watch the film anyway, but it seems like they don't focus on him enough or don't give
Yeah.
us enough information about him. Like you said, there's a murder charge. I mean, we first meet him in prison, and yeah, it's kind of glossed over. And I find Brad Pitt the more interesting main character. Although I see why they had to have this other, the creator involved. But yeah, I think that's part of maybe what doesn't work about the film is that maybe they don't spend enough time on certain elements or certain aspects of the plot, maybe, or characters. How'd you feel about that?
Yeah, I feel like I mean, no pun intended, but I feel like this movie was kind of a sketch.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah, that's good, right? That's pretty good. But this movie is kind of a sketch for something that could have been more refined. It just kind of felt like there were a lot of interesting ideas that at play, but none of them were really leaned into. Which, as we noted, the backstory of this originally, Bakshi had something kind of totally different in mind, and because of studio pressure, and it ended up being a lot more Roger Rabbit-esque. A lot more of this mystery and I think that ultimately it to me feels like a too many cooks in the kitchen kind of situation
Yeah.
where there were a lot of ideas being thrown at it from a lot of different places, and I think that Bakshi maybe just lost his patience with it. I do know that at one point he had hired a bunch of animators to do background characters and basically told them just have the characters do whatever that you want them to. I just want them to be moving around doing weird things the whole time. So it does seem like Bakshi kind of hit his wit's end with this movie.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like this one was one he passionately saw all the way through and fought till the very end to make perfect. It kind of felt like he was on a contract and he did his best, but he also wasn't going to push himself past his own limits to make this great.
Exactly. Like there is still that edginess to it. There is that edginess to the characters. I feel like, and as we said, like the cool world itself as a world is it's a very familiar territory for Bakshi. It's sleazy, it's seedy, and certainly deals with themes that we've seen him explore before. And there is a little bit of the edginess to the characters, I think. And I think that's what makes it different from the more wholesome characters we saw portrayed in Who Framed Roger Rabbit and other films like that. And I think that's another aspect of like what could have made this movie really really try not to use the word cool, but it could have made it really cool if these aspects or elements were explored a little more deeply, which I'm sure Bakshi wanted to. So we'll get right to it. Like this one is not known for being a box office smash, as we alluded to with the Rotten
lost
Tomatoes.
A lot of money.
Yeah, it's actually known for its very storied and troubled production history, and for being a bomb basically when it was released in theaters. And for people following Ralph Bakshi's story as a filmmaker, which obviously is what we're doing here, it is a fascinating turn, I would say, like in the trajectory of his career. In some ways, it is the climax of his career as an animator and a director. So it's intriguing to look at the film in that light and to see what led us here, and the films we talked about, like how did we kind of get to this point? Do you see this in some ways a culmination of what came before Jeremy?
Yeah, so one thing I was saying to Mark right before we started recording here was that in a weird way, to me, this is kind of the quintessential Ralph Bakshi film. Not in terms of quality, but in terms of everything we've seen previously. As we've discussed in previous episodes, this had the street level kind of griminess that we saw in some of Bakshi's earlier work. It had the fantasy elements that we saw in movies like Wizards. It had live action like we saw in Heavy Traffic. It had rotoscoping like we saw in American Pop. So it really does kind of capture everything that Bakshi did throughout his career. I think he just kind of got cut off a little bit. I think personally, for me, I think this movie would have been a whole different thing if he was allowed to make it R-rated. This was a PG-13 movie that was set in what should have been an R-rated world, and I think because of that, it kind of didn't feel like a more edgy. To me, this didn't feel really any more edgy than Who Framed Roger Rabbit. I mean, I think Who Framed Roger Rabbit might be a PG, but that was in the days when PG and PG-13. Actually, I don't even know if PG-13 existed when Who Framed Roger Rabbit came out.
I believe it did. Yeah,
or did it just been
Temple of Doom was the first PG-13, I believe, which it came out before that, right? Or no, actually, you know what? That came out 89. So You might be right.
Yeah, I think it was right around then.
So it was PG probably. Yeah.
Yeah, Who Framed Roger Rabbit was PG.
Right. Okay. So yeah, like you said, this is PG. So Cool World is PG-13, and you can really feel Bakshi holding back from going truly wild. Like, we've seen him doing some of his other films. I mean, his very first film, Fritz the Cat, was X-rated.
Yeah.
And he had there's many stories of him fighting with the studios about ratings and things like that. So this one, yeah, it feels almost kind of I don't know, limp. It's like
yeah, no, that's a good word for it. That's a perfect
that,
word for it. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't have that oomph to it that his other films have, and so there's lots of reasons for the failure and of this film. Looking back in hindsight, you can kind of see it there. So, as we alluded to a couple times now, this movie Cool World was originally sold as a hard R animated / live action horror film, and I find this original pitch pretty fascinating. So, the original pitch that Bakshi gave was so it was about a basically a cartoon character, or I guess comic strip character, I'm not sure exactly what it was, that was birthed when a human and a animated character got together, and she seeks revenge trying to kill her father. The daughter does, so she comes into the real world and tries to slay her father, basically, which is a very dark premise. But one I would have liked to have seen that. I would have been curious how he would have handled a straight horror film with incorporating animation and whatnot.
Yeah.
But
I could see it being really scary, like really
like
scary,
disturbingly scary. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think mostly when Kim Basinger came on board, was attached to star in the film, I think that's when things started to change. And I think her and the studio probably had talks, most likely without Bakshi even in the room. I mean, who knows? But about the kind of reaction that the movie would generate. I think it just kind of went from there, and it started to soften, and the film became PG-13 rated, and that, I don't think it's what Bakshi was going for. So there's a lot of missed opportunities with the film, but. It could have been like I don't think, would it have ever been Who Framed Roger Rabbit? Definitely, I don't think so.
No.
Would it have been a success? Who knows? Would it have been an interesting cult film? Yes, I think it would be. We consider it a cult film because it is under the radar and all these different aspects. But I don't find it a successful cult film, but it could have been. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Instead, it's just kind of it's like I said,
it's a note in it's a weird note in an amazing career.
Exactly.
It's
an
important
way to leave off. Yeah.
It's important because Bakshi made it. It's not important because of the film. There are some interesting things happening in the film, though. One thing that I would really like to note is because it was this half animated, half live action world. You would think that all of the sequences taking place in the cool world itself, the animated version of this world, all the backgrounds would be animated. But actually, for some of the backgrounds, what they did is they drew backgrounds and then printed them so they were 12, 13 feet tall. So the live action characters were walking in front of what were basically giant prints instead of real backgrounds, or instead of like green screen backgrounds, which I thought was actually pretty wonderful.
I actually didn't know that.
Yeah, you almost don't catch it if you're not looking. I only noticed it because there was one piece of set where I saw like an edge, and I'm like, oh, that's kind of weird, and I kind of looked into it a little bit. But first, this movie in particular, kind of, we keep mentioning him, makes me think of Terry Gilliam, because that's exactly the kind of thing he would do. Like a printed, weird, surreal background that you could go for some kind of realism, but instead you just acknowledge the artifice that film is in and of itself, particularly something where animation is incorporated.
Yeah.
And I love that they printed the backgrounds. I thought that
really
was,
cool,
it was wildly original, and kind of like a really innovative approach.
Definitely.
In an era where I think also at that time, green screens were a thing. Mm-hmm. We're getting into the 90s here, and
not
computers,
as used as they are now, but
not as used, but they had the technology to just do all these backgrounds on a green screen, and the fact that they decided that they wanted something hand done about it, they wanted that feel, and weren't just going to jump on the new technology just because it was out there, I think is commendable, and I think that might be a battle that Bakshi actually won, although one of not many in this particular case.
Definitely. Well, this is obviously the most live action we've seen in one of his films so far to this point, right? So, but I would, as far as techniques go, we've talked about his techniques in other films. Oddly enough, I would say this film is probably the least experimental. Even though he does
Yeah,
incorporate uh, animation with live action, which is no easy task, and I'm sure it was kind of a nightmare to shoot and everything. I would say that like I don't know, it feels like other than that, there wasn't too much he did. Like Bakshi's kind of known for throwing, like his kitchen sink approach of throwing everything in there, all these different techniques. We saw it a lot in like Wizards and things like that, where during the battle scenes there would be stock footage going on and rotoscoping and traditional animation and like all these different aspects. So you don't see too much of that. And obviously, I would say the animation live action integration. We've seen that at play before in his films, but to a much larger degree here, where the plot actually hinges on it. But Roger Rabbit, it ain't.
yeah,
It's still pretty impressive in its own way, and he does create his own world, like I said. But the actual interactions between the human characters and the animated characters, I mean, in my opinion, they aren't that great. They're a little less convincing than they were done in
yeah.
in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is kind of like that's like the holy grail of these types of films, right? You like hold everything to that light. So
That and
um,
Space Jam,
and Space
classic.
Jam, of course.
Yeah,
Well, yeah, we'll have to talk about that on future
at some
episode.
point.
That's a cult film, right? It's got to
Yeah.
be by now. So yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't know how you felt. I mean, well, let me ask you, how did you feel about the way that live action was integrated with the animation and vice versa? Do you think it was done well in the film? Or do you feel like
I don't know if done well is the right
it
term.
almost feels like rushed to me or something? Or
Yeah,
like
it doesn't totally connect.
yeah,
Like I said, there were moments that I thought were really interesting. More for me in um, like I mentioned with the built sets and everything. It was
mm-hmm,
more how the real live action actors were incorporated into the animated world. I
mm-hmm,
thought that the animated characters weren't incorporated as well into the real world.
mm-hmm,
I thought that when they were drawn with the real characters, it didn't land as much. When the
yeah.
real characters were put in these animated spaces, I found that to be interesting. What
What did
about
you
you, Mark?
think about? Well, what did you think about the world itself? The actual like cool world that he created for the film.
Well, I actually really enjoyed it.
Mm-hmm,
I think personally, I tend to be drawn towards these kind. I mean, I love film noir. I
mm-hmm,
consume it regularly and in large volume. But what I found interesting about this is there's this weird thing, and it's hard to explain. It's hard to kind of quantify. But there is this idea of this kind of golden age Hollywood glamour from the I would say like late 40s, early 50s. This kind of, you walk into a club and there's jazz music playing with a beautiful
yeah.
busty singer, with her hair done
Mm-hmm,
perfectly and the light hitting her
mm-hmm,
just right. And there's a certain thing that for some reason, I think you mentioned this is a very 90s feeling thing, seemed to
mm-hmm,
come up a lot in 90s. And
mm-hmm,
and I think that for me, I enjoyed the world, but I enjoy the idea in seeing this as a bigger piece of cinema as a whole, and how in cinema and culture we tend to look back at certain times and only take certain elements
mm-hmm.
from those time periods. And I thought it was interesting the particular um, elements that this film chose to pull out of its source material. The Marilyn Monroe thing,
Yeah.
the jazz music, the
Mm-hmm.
the color palettes, the cars. It was like I
Yeah.
liked the world, but I liked the curation of the world more than the world itself, I think.
Yeah. Whereas Who Framed Roger Rabbit was kind of like a noir detective story. This was more of like a neo noir. It was almost like a
Yeah.
fantasy noir, or like a Sin City kind of world.
Well, it almost
Um,
felt like, interestingly, a few years later, L.A. Confidential,
yeah, a
which
little bit.
Kim Basinger maybe got that role because of this.
Oh yeah,
Which is
you're right.
totally possible.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great movie, and this had a similar kind of derivative. It's not supposed to be
Yeah.
actually the 1940s. It's supposed to be the 1940s through rose tinted glasses.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I have a soft spot for certain things. Like I've always liked the idea of a completely invented world in films, like when they completely make it from scratch and it's very like self-contained and
Yeah,
I always enjoy that. So it's fascinating to me when someone essentially creates their own universe and the choices they make to fill that world and things like that. And I do like the characters that inhabit it. I mean, they're very cartoony. The cartoons are very cartoony. Go figure.
as
But
are the live
um,
action. I mean, the
Yeah.
way these characters are portrayed. Like Brad Pitt is not trying to
Yeah.
portray a
But
real
for him,
police officer. He's doing a cartoonish, Humphrey
yeah,
Bogart version of.
right. But for him, like for his character, I thought it made sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the actual cartoons are very cartoony. Like they randomly morph into things, like you see like in the older cartoons, like Warner Brothers and stuff like that. Do things that no human could do, and I like that. And in a lot of ways, I saw it as Bakshi kind of paying tribute to the cartoons he grew up on and that inspired him. And ones that when he worked at Terrytoons and stuff, when he would be part of that system, and I think he genuinely enjoyed that kind of animation, and I think that's what he was inspired by, and obviously he puts his own twist on it, but I think it's all there in this film, which is kind of a cool thing. So yeah, I like that aspect of it, the actual world building of it, but again, it feels a little, to me, I thought disjointed and almost a little too vague for its own good. Like it just doesn't, if you had to describe what Cool World actually was, like, and the characters that inhabit it, I don't know if you'd be able to. It's
all
and
over
if
the
that's
place.
and if that's part of an issue with the script, like the screenplay, or if that's the producers or the studio, who knows?
Who knows? Yeah, it was a while
Could be
ago.
anyone, but it was a while ago.
It was
'92. I mean,
so at this point,
yeah. No, I'm saying definitely.
Yeah. So Mark, any favorite moments or closing notes?
Closing notes. Favorite moments. Let me think. I don't know if any moments stuck out really. It was just like, yeah, I don't know if there's any moments that stuck out.
Yeah, which is fair.
Oddly enough for this film, which is weird, like, because I talked about when I was a kid and I remember this being on TV, like seeing commercials for it and things like that. Oddly enough, the trailer for this film always stuck out to me. And I think part of the reason is because part of it's, I was a kid and I would see this trailer and be like, what is this? Like this looks so awesome. And, and just the way the film was portrayed in those trailers, as we know, sometimes trailers aren't, they lie to us a little bit.
A little bit, yeah, a little bit.
Forthcoming. So to me, I remember the trailer more than anything, and I just remember the feeling like that trailer gives you, like this is going to be a really kind of like dark, like cool, gritty, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which is what I think he set out to make, but ultimately not really what the film became. Did you have any moments that you enjoyed with the film?
I mean, yeah, there were little moments here and there. I think I really enjoyed the backgrounds. Like
the backgrounds are great. Yeah,
like
elements of the film are interesting. Yeah,
like it is hard to just pick one specific moment and say, "Oh, that was so great." Well, one thing that I did like was kind of the transition when the Hollywood character turns into a real person. I thought that was done.
That was cool. Yeah,
that was cool.
That was something in the trailer too. Like they showed that part in there, and I liked how they did that with the kind of cutting back and forth, like the kind of jump cuts of them being cartoon and them being human. That was so cool.
I thought that was interesting. One thing that it wasn't even in the movie, but that I just thought was so wonderful was apparently in the promotion for this movie, they made.
I want to talk about this.
Yeah, they made a gigantic cutout of the Hollywood character and had her sitting on top of the Hollywood sign,
which shows that apparently, Paramount obviously believed in this film's eventual success, because you wouldn't just do that if you were like, oh, this thing's gonna bomb, So, as a publicity stunt, that's huge. And
it's wonderful. It's wonderful. It's fucking brilliant. Pardon my French.
Did you look up pictures of it? Did you look at it?
Yeah, it's great, and I would highly recommend looking it up if you have the chance, because it's hysterical. It's so surreal.
It is very surreal, and it's hysterical that it angered so many people too.
Yeah, people were
all
furious.
The local residents were like, "What are you doing?" Like,
which is funny to me personally.
Yeah.
And
like,
first
we live in Hollywood.
Yeah. So first off, this sign was huge. Like, we're not talking about like a little tiny like this sign was about as big as one of the letters on the Hollywood sign. Which I wonder, as my background in addition to movies is also graphic design. And I have a feeling it would probably be really hard to see what it actually is from far away. So people are probably just like, what's that thing on top of the D in the Hollywood sign? But also, if you live in Hollywood, you have to, I would imagine, I mean, like, I live in New York, and you hit a point where you don't question weird promotional things coming into your life after a while. So I find it very bizarre that anyone would be even slightly upset by a Hollywood film doing the most classic Hollywood promotion you could possibly imagine. So
And
I
again,
think it's wonderful, personally.
yeah, and again, Hollywood is sort of a fascinating character. I mean, I think maybe she wasn't handled great within the film, but
Hmm.
I saw her as like kind of like a Jessica Rabbit. Go back to
Yeah.
Who Framed Roger Rabbit again, but kind of like a Jessica Rabbit if she was completely let loose. Like,
Yeah.
literally just all she wants is to get laid.
Yeah. Or
So
like a Rita, you know,
yeah,
uh,
kind of like that.
or not Rita.
Um,
I just totally blanked on that. Rita Hayworth. What's the movie? A Gilda. Yeah,
Gilda.
like a
Okay,
Gilda
I knew
character. A
I knew what you were
Rita.
talking about though.
That's right. Yeah, and no, I had the
Yeah.
actress right. No, yeah, like a Gilda character.
Yeah.
Any classic,
Hmm.
Hollywood noir
Yeah.
femme fatale. She fits right in there.
And you feel her longing too. Like there's a line actually noted here. She said when they, Hollywood's talking about humans and how she wants to feel the power that a human feels, and she says when they touch something, they really touch it. There are aspects of this film that I think are worth exploring. And I think maybe in another, who knows, maybe Ralph Bakshi, he's pretty old now, but maybe he could still tackle something like this. But I do want to leave just on one other anecdote because I found this interesting regarding his Bakshi's fight with the studio. So there's this character, Frank Minisco. Well, he's a real person, but Frank Minisco Jr. He is kind of known for he's not doesn't have the best reputation in Hollywood, and he was a producer on this film. And apparently, Ralph Bakshi was almost fired and sued by Frank Minisco because he punched him in the nose after he told him this film was being changed. So that just shows you, but it also shows you how Bakshi, how fiery he is, how passionate he is. And he just doesn't give a damn. Like he just, he really wants what he wants. But I mean, I think ultimately in the end, he had to concede and give in to the studio because he just didn't have a choice at a certain point. So he gave in to the studio and to the star because apparently Basinger, as good as she is in this movie, she was expecting something very different. And there's a really funny quote when Bakshi's talking about this. I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he's discussing what Kim Basinger as an actress thought this film was going to be, and she said something along the lines of, "I want sick children in hospitals to be able to watch Cool World," and
Which is so absurd.
And it was pretty much like this. It ain't that movie, this ain't it.
Like, have you seen anything I've made?
Exactly,
It's
like it's just completely clueless. So I found that pretty funny, and that kind of sums up like how the main actress and the studio was viewing the film and how Bakshi was viewing it. So two completely different personalities and what's the word I'm looking for? Philosophies, I guess, for this film. So
in direct conflict with each other.
Indirect conflict, especially when he punched him in the nose, which is great.
Yeah.
So this film was a failure, as we discussed. And I'm sure Bakshi took it pretty hard because he was coming out of a slump before this, and I'm sure he thought this would be something, and he put a lot of work into it, as he always does. And it came out and kind of just flopped. And so we'll talk about a little bit just after this film what he went on to do. Not too much. He went on to, I guess, immediately following this was the next thing he did was a short-lived animated series for HBO called Spicy City, which, from what I've seen, shares a lot thematically with Cool World, the actual like look and feel of it. And he had that for, I think it's only 6 episodes or something like that. It's one season. It did not get renewed. I think I read into that a little bit, and eventually HBO wanted to change that. So he ran into the same issue where someone was trying to control his work. And so he left, and he all but left Hollywood, and now mostly uses his artistry skills to paint. He does a lot of painting now. And one other thing I wanted to touch on was the film Last Days of Coney Island, which was, as of 2019, when we were recording this, the last film that Bakshi has created himself and made. It's a short film, and this is interesting because, so in 2013, Bakshi launched a Kickstarter campaign. Very new thing, obviously, and he was able to obtain funding for this film. Last Days of Coney Island was something he had in the back of his head for a long time, something he wanted to make for a long time. And the actor Matthew Modine was actually cast in the film, and he was a longtime Bakshi fan apparently. And he came, when he came across the Kickstarter, he helped get some momentum to it. So it was released on Vimeo in 2019, Last Days of Coney Island, and I have seen the film, and I actually really enjoyed it. It was actually when it came out, was when I saw it. So I don't remember it, verbatim or anything, but it's very Bakshi, because I was a little worried using newer technology. It's still traditionally animated, but he finished it using digital technology and newer technology, which for him was great.
Yeah.
And there's a great quote about that, actually, I want to read very quickly here. He's quoted as saying, the animation is probably higher quality than anything I ever made, at a cost so low it's embarrassing. Everything I used to do in my old movies that required hundreds of people and huge salaries is now done in a box. It took 250 people to make Heavy Traffic. Now I'm down to 5. I kiss the computer every morning.
Yeah.
So obviously happy that it didn't take as long and that he didn't need as much manpower and he was able to complete this film. And I think it's worth checking out, especially if you've gone on this journey with us. I think it's worth seeing. It's still very Bakshi. It touches on a lot of the themes that he's touched on before that we've seen him explore, but in it's different to see, with that digital sheen on it. It's a little different, and it's worth checking out.
I do think that quote is kind of maybe the perfect way to wrap up our series on Bakshi here, though, in a way, because
definitely.
Ralph Bakshi is a real artist who has vision. He's determined, and he's happy to use any technology, any people, anything he can get his hands on to make the work as best as it can possibly be made. And he's not precious. He just wants to create and create and create. And he's someone who has had to fight to do that. Definitely. And he's someone who's won some battles and lost some battles, but really left behind a pretty terrific legacy of wonderful, wonderful films that I personally couldn't recommend more.
Definitely. He really is a true auteur, as you said. And whether you're into animation, whether you're not into animation, if you're into anything non-mainstream, I would say definitely check out his films. It's very much worth it. And obviously, if you listen to the series, you probably have already checked them out. Hopefully you have.
But recommend them to people. Tell people about the films.
Yes, tell others to watch Ralph Bakshi films. They'll thank you later. So that's going to, I think, do it for us for the Ralph Bakshi series here, the animated world of Ralph Bakshi. So tune in next time. We're going to go into a whole new subject and explore a whole new series of films. Thanks for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes, Podbean, and Spotify, as well as on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, or if you'd like to officially join the cult and be a guest on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.